Hello friends, welcome again. Friends, we are the students of English literature and we know that literature and criticism go side by side. In my previous videos, I have discussed the critical theories as expounded by Plato, Aristotle, Longinus, Dante, Sidney, John Dryden and many more. But friends, in this video today I am going to discuss the critical theories as given by William Wordsworth. Friends, the lovers of literature, they know William Wordsworth as the poet of nature. We know him as a romantic poet, but at the same time, we must also consider William Wordsworth as a revolutionary critic. Why? Because during his times, he expounded some critical theories which brought about a revolution in English literature and English criticism. And this revolution comes in the form of Preface to Lyrical Ballads, published by William Wordsworth in 1798. Friends, what is this Preface to Lyrical Ballads? Let me explain this thing to you, that William Wordsworth was writing poetry during the time when classicism, or you can say neoclassicism, was much popular among the scholars. Nobody was interested in romanticism, and Wordsworth was a romantic poet. He wanted to publish his lyrics. So the collection of lyrical ballads he wanted to publish, and to explain why romanticism is important in literature, he wrote a preface. He wrote a kind of introduction to his lyrical ballads. So this introduction, this preface, becomes a critical treatise by William Wordsworth, and that was published in 1798. And friends, this is considered as a landmark in the history of literary criticism. Why? Because from this date onwards, from 1798 onwards, we have a new era. We have the beginning of a new era known as the period of Romantic Revival. It is known as the period of Romanticism, and the credit goes to William Wordsworth. Wordsworth actually revolted against the boredom of neoclassicism. Wordsworth's feelings, if somebody asks me to summarize his feelings in some poetic lines, then I would like to quote the character of Hamlet from William Shakespeare's tragedy. Just like Hamlet, as if William Wordsworth was speaking these lines in those days: "The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right." William Wordsworth was born to set the direction of literature, the direction of poetry in the right direction, and he did it by publishing the Preface to Lyrical Ballads. William Wordsworth's lyrics, his poetry and his critical theories, we can say they heralded, they started a new era of romanticism in English literature. So friends, what was his contribution to criticism, or what were Wordsworth's ideas about poetry that we are going to discuss one by one. Number one, Wordsworth has written about the kind of subject matter of poetry in literature. William Wordsworth, he discarded the neoclassical approach in English poetry. Friends, if you want to understand William Wordsworth's critical theories and understand Wordsworth as a poet, you should compare and contrast the poets who are writing in his times or the poets who are writing in the recent history, that means during the 18th century. Remember, 18th century was the age of neoclassicism. There was no scope for romanticism. 18th century was the period of prose literature. Novels and essays, periodical essays, they were highly popular all throughout the 18th century. Poetry had lost its power, but the credit goes to William Wordsworth, who made it popular by publishing his lyrical ballads. The busy urban life was no longer now the subject matter in Wordsworth's poetry. Because if you compare Wordsworth's poetry with other poets, other novelists or other essays, then other writers, they focused on the expression of the aristocratic people, on the expression of the urban life, on the expression of the hectic life of the people. But Wordsworth believed that rustic life, the life of the village, has the soothing power. Being a romantic poet, and the poet of nature, Wordsworth advocated for the rustic life and for the simple life in poetry. He believed that the poet must focus on the simplicity of life, because true emotions develop in the natural behavior of man. And according to Wordsworth, emotions, the feelings, they are more important in poetry than anything else. And that's why, artificial life of the city is discarded, is rejected by Wordsworth in his poetry. So as far as subject matter of poetry is concerned, Wordsworth strongly believed, he was a determined poet. He believed that the subject matter must be the rustic life, the simplicity of the village life. Next idea that he has presented in his preface to Lyrical Ballads is the use of what kind of poetic diction the poets should use in poetry. Wordsworth's concept, his idea of poetic diction, goes against the classical theory. Because before the times of Wordsworth, people were following the classical style of writing literature. But Wordsworth protested against the artificial pedantry and affectation. Wordsworth believed that poetry is not a medium to make a pomp and show of your knowledge of language, because many poets who followed the neoclassical style of writing literature, they wrought a grand style, dignified style in poetry and literature. They wanted to show their pedantic, their scholarship about language. And Wordsworth shows a red light to this. Why? Because the moment you try to make an artificial show, artificial pomp and show, you forget the real spontaneous emotions. According to him, language of the rustic people is the fittest medium, is the ideal medium to express the genuine feelings of the people living in rural areas. So, the subject matter is the rustic life, and the language, the diction must also be from the rustic life. Language that the poet should use in poetry should be the language of the common man and women, because poetry spurs naturally in the simple language of the people. According to him, high phraseological kind of language or too much archaism makes the poetry artificial, and true poetry must be natural expression. Third important thing to note about his critical theories is his famous definition of poetry. Wordsworth has rejected intellectualism in literature, in poetry, and he welcomes emotions, sentiments, right? He defines poetry, I quote, "Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility." Friends, let's try and understand this small definition. There are two phrases in this definition. Number one, poetry is a spontaneous means effortless, automatic, natural. Poetry is a natural overflow of powerful feelings. Okay. Say for example, you are wandering somewhere on the banks of the river in the evening, and you are so delighted to see the beauty of the river, the beauty of the trees and the mountains and all. Okay, so your heart becomes full of emotions, and there is an overflow of emotions, emotion of happiness, right? So what happens? Wordsworth says, don't write the poem at that time, because at that time you don't have a pen and a paper. Okay, and even if you have a pen and a paper, at that time if you start writing, that overflow will stop. Okay, so he says poetry comes how? He says when a poet observes something, and when there is an overflow of feelings, fine, he enjoys this scenario, then he comes back home, and at night when he is sitting lonely, when he is in the peace of mind, tranquility means peace. Okay, when there is a peace of mind, he recollects that experience which he had some time ago. He recollects the same experience, he recollects those emotions, and he pens down, he writes these emotions down on a piece of paper, and that, according to Wordsworth, is the true expression of emotions. That, according to Wordsworth, is the true poetry. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, strong feelings, okay, but later on recollected in peaceful atmosphere. So, poetry springs from the soul of the man. Okay, it is rightly said that the clear spring of poetry must flow freely and spontaneously. It can't be made to flow through artificially laid pipes. Can you imagine that the true flow of poetry flows from the artificial pipes? No. True emotions must come spontaneously, naturally. Poetry is born not from the mind but from the heart. Okay, so the basic difference between Wordsworth's idea of literature, of poetry, and neoclassical idea of poetry is that in neoclassical times, before Wordsworth's times, poetry appealed intellect. Poetry appeals to your mind in neoclassical times, but if you talk about romantic poetry, in Wordsworth's times, he believed that poetry is a matter of emotions. It's a matter of the expression of your strong emotions, and poetry must appeal the heart of the reader. Okay, so this is the very important idea discussed by Wordsworth in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. Moreover, step by step, Wordsworth says that poetry takes place or poetry occurs in 4 different stages. That means, the poet's mind and heart passes through these 4 stages. Number 1, the poet observes something. So, observation is the first stage. Okay, as I gave you an example, say for example in the evening you are standing somewhere at the bank of the river and you are so delighted to see the beauty of nature. So when you see this beauty, that is your observation. That is the first stage of writing poetry. Observation. Number 2, recollection. Recollection is done at home, not there. When you come back home, after some time, after 6 hours, 7 hours, 12 hours or maybe 2 days, you sit in your pensive mood, in the peaceful atmosphere, you are sitting at your home and you recollect, you remember that experience, that observation. So, recollection is the second stage. Then comes the third stage is called contemplation. Contemplation means thinking deeply. When you think deeply about the emotions which arised when you observed that particular object of nature. So, contemplation, thinking deeply on the same topic. And then when you start recollecting and when you start contemplating on that particular object, again there will be an overflow of emotions, right? So these emotions are aroused again in your heart, and these emotions are combined with imagination, kalpana. Okay. So emotions and imagination, when they come together, it gives birth to poetry. I hope it is clear. These 4 stages. First, the poet observes something, then he comes back home and recollects the same experience, then he thinks deeply on that, and then the same emotions are aroused which are combined with imagination, and that is written down on a piece of paper, which we know as true poetry according to Wordsworth. Okay. Regarding the use of meter, Wordsworth is in favor of the use of meter in poetry. Meter means chand. Meter has the power to give beauty, to give charm, and to give rhythm to poetry. And that's why Wordsworth believes that meter is an integral part of poetry. It imparts poetic beauty and it has the power to please the readers, and to please the readers, to delight the readers is the ultimate aim of the poet. So, meter is a must in poetry according to William Wordsworth. It imparts passion and rhythm to the words, and this rhythm makes it a more beautiful poem. Not only this rhythm, intensifies the emotions which are presented by the poet, and that's why meter is very important. So friends, before I leave, let me conclude this whole discussion that preface to lyrical ballads is in fact, you can say, a manifesto of new romantic movement, heralded by William Wordsworth in England. Okay, a new era of romantic revival, a new era of romanticism begins with the publication of Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth advocated for the simplicity of subject matter and simplicity of language in poetry. Rustic life and the language of the rustic people must be there in poetry. Emotions are more important in poetry than intellectualism. True poetry, according to Wordsworth, must be able to appeal the heart of the readers, touch and move the hearts of the readers. So, in short, Wordsworth emphasized on novelty. He experimented with poetry. He rejected the traditional neoclassical style of writing poetry. He was a man of liberty, you can say. He advocated for spontaneous feelings, effortless natural feelings and imagination. So, in short, you can say that William Wordsworth was the pioneer and he was the leader of romantic movement in English poetry during his times. So friends, I finish this video over here. If you like this video, please share and subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.